The sun was bleeding out across the town square, spilling orange light over cracked boards and boots scuffed with dust. The air was thick with sweat and old whiskey. Wind stirred the hanging sign above the sheriff's porch. Public auction, debts collected by law. Clara Wynne stood on a wooden crate in the middle of it all. Her wrists were bound, her shoes gone. The rope bit into her skin each time she breathed. Dust clung to her lashes like ash. "Widow of a deserter," the sheriff announced, loud enough for every sneer in the crowd to hear. "Owes the county $6.14. Payment due in labor or property." A murmur rolled through the onlookers, men in sweat-stained hats, women in faded calico. Some pitied her, others smirked. Most just wanted a show. The sheriff's hand swept the air. "Let's start the bidding." The first voice came from a ranch foreman, drunk and sunburned. $2, another laughed. $2.50, for the pretty face. Clara kept her eyes on the ground. She would not give them tears. Her throat was dry, her pride thinner than her shadow. Somewhere in the back a dog barked and was silenced with a boot. "3," said someone else. "She can clean," the sheriff grinned. "Any advance?" From the edge of the crowd, beneath the shade of the livery's awning, a man watched. Dust streaked his coat, his hat low enough to hide most of his face. His horse shifted behind him, restless. He had been there since the bell rang, silent, unreadable. When one of the bidders stepped closer and shoved Clara's shoulder, she stumbled. Laughter broke out. The sheriff didn't stop it. She caught herself, blood from her lip running down to her chin. She spat it onto the planks and said nothing. The sheriff raised the gavel. "Sold at $3. I'll take her." The voice was low, steady, and carried like thunder over flat earth. The crowd turned. The man from the shade stepped forward. Elias Gage. Somebody whispered the name as if it might summon ghosts. Gage, of the Ghost Creek Range, the man who buried his own brother after the fire. Folks said he didn't talk, didn't laugh, didn't stay in town long enough for either. He walked through them now, spurs soft in the dust. His gaze didn't waver. He laid down a handful of coins, silver, not dull. "Paid in full," the sheriff blinked, surprised but greedy enough not to question. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. The murmurs followed like flies. Didn't know Gage needed company. Maybe he's gone soft. Maybe he's lonely. Elias didn't answer them. He climbed onto the platform, reached for the knot at her wrists. His fingers were rough and scarred, but careful. The rope fell away. "You can walk?" he asked. Clara nodded, though her knees trembled. He looked at her, really looked, and something flickered in his eyes. Maybe pity, maybe something else. His hands trembled once, then stilled. "Let's go," he said. She stepped down from the crate. The dust rose around her bare feet like smoke. Every whisper from the crowd followed her, bought woman, widow, charity. She kept her chin high anyway. The sheriff called after them, voice slick. "Hope she's worth it, Gage." Elias didn't turn. "She is," he said simply. They reached his horse. He helped her up without a word. The reins creaked as he swung behind her, one hand steady on the leather, the other hovering near her arm in case she slipped. As they rode out of town, the laughter faded. The horizon swallowed them whole, all gold and shadow. Wind caught her hair and tangled it across his sleeve. She wanted to speak, to ask why he'd done it, but her throat refused. The only sound was the horse's slow rhythm and the low hum of the evening wind. Behind them, the sun sank lower, setting the dust aflame. Ahead lay open land and the long, dark road to Ghost Creek, he said softly, almost to himself. "Let's go home." The wind took the words, carrying them across the prairie until even the echoes died. The first mile out of town was only wind and dust. Then came the sky. It darkened fast, blue turning to bruised purple, clouds folding in on themselves like muscle. The prairie, flat and endless, swallowed what little light remained. Clara held to the saddle horn, the horse's gait jerking beneath her. Each breath stung from the cold. The hem of her dress clung heavy with rain and grit. Elias rode just ahead, hat pulled low, his coat already slick with water. The storm had been waiting for them. Lightning cracked behind the hills, and the thunder chased close behind, rolling like the growl of something ancient. "Keep your head down," he said over the wind. She did. Rain came harder, stinging her cheeks. The town had vanished behind them, nothing left but the echo of laughter and the sheriff's gavel. For the first time in days, she could breathe without hearing her name spat like a curse. When the trail turned to mud, the horse stumbled. Elias swung down, hand gripping the reins, guiding them through the mire. The animal limped, favoring one leg. "Step off," he said. She hesitated. "I can walk." "Then do." Her boots, borrowed from a saddlebag, sank deep in the wet clay. Lightning split the sky again, white and fierce. For an instant, she saw him clearly, soaked to the bone, jaw tight, one hand bleeding where a nail from the auction platform had torn his palm. "You're hurt," she said. He didn't answer. He tore a strip from his sleeve and wrapped the hand without slowing his step. His voice was rough when it finally came. "Storm will get worse before it eases." They pressed on. The prairie seemed endless, the rain relentless. Wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face. Every step felt heavier, colder, but he never let the horse fall behind. When her knees gave out, he caught her by the arm. His touch was firm, almost angry. "We're close," he said. "Just a little further." She didn't ask how he knew. Ahead, through the veil of rain, a shape emerged. Crooked roof, broken chimney, one side caved from a storm years gone. His cabin. Ghost Creek homestead. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. It moaned in protest. Inside smelled of wet wood and smoke long since gone cold. He struck a match and found an old lantern on a hook. Light flared, soft and trembling. The place was half ruin, half refuge. One wall bowed inward, patched with rough boards. A hearth crouched low at the far side, black with soot. He dropped an armful of dry kindling from a covered box, coaxed flame from it with slow patience. "Sit by the fire," he said. Clara knelt near the warmth, hands shaking too much to undo the wet buttons of her dress. He noticed but said nothing. Instead, he shrugged off his coat and laid it beside her. She blinked up at him. "You'll freeze," he shrugged. "You need it more." The fire caught, small and crackling. Shadows rose and fell across the walls. Two strangers cast in flickering gold. He checked the bandage on his palm, wincing once. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find words that fit. Her throat still carried the taste of rain and dust. Outside, the storm hit harder, tearing at the shutters. The wind moaned like a voice trying to get in. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. Elias looked at her then, eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. "Didn't have to watch either." The words landed heavy. The fire popped between them, a spark leaping, dying. For a long while they sat apart, her watching the flames, him staring into nothing. The sound of rain on the roof softened. The air warmed enough for breath to slow, shoulders to drop. Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in months, silence didn't mean danger. It meant rest. Elias leaned back against the wall, listening to the storm die in stages. His coat hung over her shoulders. Her breathing evened out. Outside, the wind carried away the last of the laughter that had haunted them both. Inside, only the fire spoke, low, patient, alive. The first ember of trust had found its place. Morning came pale and thin, dragging mist off the prairie. Light filtered through the torn curtain, turning the room silver gray. The fire in the hearth had gone to ash. The world felt quiet enough to break. Clara woke first. Her body ached from the cold floor, but she said nothing. She found a needle in a tin on the table and began to mend the curtain, her hands stiff and clumsy. The thread frayed each time she pulled it through, but she kept at it. It gave her something to do, something that wasn't remembering. Outside, the sound of a hammer rang in slow rhythm. Elias at the fence line, setting posts back upright after the storm. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat in the open air. When he came in for water, he paused by the door. She didn't look up. He watched her patching, the way her fingers shook, the way she bit the inside of her cheek to keep them steady. "You don't have to fix what's already broken," he said. She didn't turn. Then nothing out here would ever get mended. He almost smiled, but the expression caught on something deeper. He nodded once, filled his cup from the barrel, and stepped back out into the wind. By noon, the sun had burned through the haze. Clara swept dust from the floorboards, careful not to move anything that looked deliberate. Still, curiosity lingered. The cabin held more silence than furniture, an empty shelf, a single chair, and a drawer half open beneath the table. She shouldn't have looked. She knew that. But when she saw the glint of brass, her fingers moved before her better judgment did. Inside lay a small locket. Old, dull at the edges, its hinge nearly seized with age. She pried it open. No picture, no portrait. Only a pressed wildflower, paper thin and pale as bone. It looked fragile enough to crumble from breath alone. Something about it ached in her chest. She brushed her thumb over the petals, wondering who he'd kept it for. A mother, a lover, a grave. The door opened. Elias froze in the frame. For a long moment, neither spoke. His eyes went from her face to the locket in her hand. "Don't," he said. The word cracked like dry timber. Clara startled, closing the locket at once. "I wasn't—" "Don't touch that." He crossed the floor, took it from her gently but with a kind of panic. His fingers trembled around it before he slid it back into the drawer and shut it with a finality that made her flinch. "I didn't mean any harm," she said softly. His jaw tightened. "Some things ain't meant to be handled." Then he turned and left, the door slamming behind him. For the rest of the afternoon, the air inside the cabin felt smaller. Clara took the bucket and walked to the creek. The sky had gone bruised with clouds again. She knelt by the water, trying to swallow the sting behind her eyes. She wasn't crying for his anger, not exactly. She was crying because the wildflower had looked dead and kept anyway, like something worth remembering, no matter how much it hurt. When she heard footsteps behind her, she didn't turn. "I wasn't stealing," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was low, rough with regret. He stopped a few feet away. The wind carried the scent of smoke and rain off his coat. "I shouldn't have raised my voice," he said. "It wasn't about you," Clara nodded without looking up. The creek shimmered gold under the fading sun. Neither spoke again. When he left, she sat until the light turned to dusk. That night, after supper eaten in silence, she did something small. She stepped outside and found a wildflower growing near the fence, a stubborn little bloom clinging to dry soil. She plucked it, careful not to crush the stem. Inside, the firelight painted the walls amber. She set the flower on the windowsill, just above where he'd placed his locket drawer. When Elias came in, boots muddy, he stopped short. Her eyes met his for a breath. "Returning what I took," she said. He looked at the bloom, faint, trembling in the draft, and nodded once. Neither spoke again, but something shifted in the quiet. The storm outside was gone, but another kind of weather had changed. The wildflower stood between them, fragile and alive, a symbol of something not yet spoken, but understood. Elias left at first light, the sound of hooves fading into the morning hush. The world beyond the cabin felt too wide for Clara to look at too long, so she turned back to what she could mend. The door hung crooked from last night's wind, its bottom edge dragging against the dirt floor. She found a rusted hinge in his toolbox, hammered it straight with the heel of her hand, and set it right. Each strike sent a jolt through her arms, but she didn't stop. Outside, the dog, an old black shepherd with one torn ear, watched her from the porch. He didn't bark. He simply waited, eyes soft, tail twitching at the smallest motion of her hand. When the bucket needed filling, she carried it to the creek. The cold bit her fingers, turned her skin raw. Still, she worked until the chores quieted the restless thoughts that tried to crawl back in. By midday, the sky turned clean and bright. She found herself humming, the sound small and foreign in her own throat. It had been years since music dared live in her chest. Elias reached town to the same whispers he'd left behind. Men leaned on barrels, women lowered their voices. "Bought himself a wife," one said. "Not a wife," another muttered. "A ghost with debts." He ignored them, shoulders stiff beneath the dust of the trail. The blacksmith tipped his hat but didn't smile. At the store, the clerk counted the coins too slow, as if trying to read the story behind each one. When Elias turned to leave, someone laughed near the doorway. "You saving souls now, Gage?" He didn't answer, only met the man's eyes until the laughter died where it stood. Then he walked out, supplies bundled under his arm, wind at his back. By the time he returned, dusk had turned the land gold and long-shadowed. The cabin's chimney smoked, a thin, steady line. The door, once broken, stood straight again. Inside, Clara sat near the hearth, sleeves rolled, skin pinked with blisters. The old dog slept at her feet, belly full. She looked up when he entered. "You're back." He set the sack on the table. "Saw the door. It needed fixing. You didn't have to." Her gaze held his, steady now. "You didn't either." The air seemed to still between them. The line hung there, soft, dangerous, honest. Elias swallowed the words that rose behind it. He saw the cracks in her palms, the careful way she hid pain behind small gestures. Something in his chest ached, something that hadn't moved in years. He poured her a cup of water, left it by her hand, and turned to stoke the fire. Night fell slow. The wind outside grew gentle, brushing against the windows like a ghost asking to come in. Clara sat by the hearth, humming that old hymn again, something half-remembered from a church she once stood outside of but never entered. Elias sat across from her, sharpening his knife on a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, quiet. Between them, the dog sighed in sleep. The firelight painted the room in shades of amber. Her face caught it first, all soft edges and unspoken sorrow. His followed, lined, shadowed, half hidden by the brim of his hat. They were two kinds of broken, hers visible, his buried. When the knife finally gleamed, he set it down. The silence after her song lingered like smoke. "No one's ever called me kind," he said. She looked up from the fire, her voice barely more than a breath. "Then they've been blind all along." The words landed like prayer, simple, clean, undeserved. He couldn't look at her for a moment. Just watch the flame bend and flare, as if it too had heard something worth believing. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of sage. Inside, the quiet stretched, not empty, but full. They sat until the coals dimmed to red, until the dog stirred and the night deepened, and for the first time, neither of them felt alone. The sun was sliding down the far hills when the rider came. The day had been quiet, too quiet, Clara thought. She'd been hanging washed shirts on the line when the horse appeared on the ridge, a dark cut against the sky. Elias looked up from chopping wood. His shoulders stiffened before the sound even reached them, the low drum of hooves, deliberate and unhurried. A man who rode that calm didn't come for good reasons. By the time the rider reached the yard, the light had gone copper. Dust swirled in slow circles around his boots as he dismounted. His badge caught the last gleam of sun. "Deputy Lorne," Elias said, voice flat. The man tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sheriff sent me down the trail. Said I'd find something worth his time." Clara froze by the porch. Her hands were still wet from the wash water, knuckles white against the rail. Lorne turned his gaze to her and spat into the dirt. "Heard the runaway widow was keeping house for you, Gage. Guess the stories are true." Elias didn't move. "State your business." "The business is the law," Lorne said, drawing a folded paper from his coat. "This here says the bounty on her dead husband ain't closed. Property and partners included." Clara's breath caught. "He's dead. The war took him. Dead or not, he owed the county. And debts don't die easy out here." Elias stepped forward, slow but sure. The rifle in his hand stayed pointed at the ground, though his thumb rested on the hammer. "She's under my roof. That makes her under my protection." Lorne's grin sharpened. "Didn't figure you for the law-breaking type, Gage. Thought you had your fill of trouble after the fire." The silence that followed was heavy enough to bend the air. Elias's eyes didn't waver. "You best ride back before the light goes." Lorne spit again, turned toward his horse. "Suit yourself. But the law's coming for both of you." He swung into the saddle. "Ghost Creek's got ghosts for a reason." Then he rode off, leaving dust and the sound of hooves fading into the dark. Clara stood there long after he was gone. The shirts on the line whipped in the wind like white flags. Elias leaned the rifle against the post. "You all right?" She nodded, though she wasn't. Her throat burned with words she'd swallowed too long. "He's not wrong," she whispered. "About my husband." He waited. She sank to the porch step, fingers tangled in her skirt. They said he deserted his unit, sold army mules for whiskey. But it wasn't him. The captain blamed him to cover his own theft. I tried to clear his name, and they called me a liar. Then he died before I could prove anything. Her voice cracked. They said I helped him, that I forged his papers. I never even saw them. Elias said nothing. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass. I thought leaving would make it stop, she went on. But you can't outrun the kind of shame people decide you deserve. He sat beside her, slow and deliberate, the porch creaking under his weight. The firelight from inside brushed the edge of his face, catching the scar across his jaw. You expect me to be angry, he said quietly. I would be, she said. He looked out toward the prairie, where twilight was turning the grass to silver. You believe in second chances? She turned to him, eyes wet but steady. I used to. Then you're due for one. She let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. You don't even know me, he met her gaze. I know what it's like to be blamed for something you couldn't save. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and the soft rustle of petals. She followed his eyes to the porch rail, tiny white wildflowers, scattered from the field beyond. Caught by the breeze and laid there like offerings, Clara reached for one, its stem bending beneath her touch. She twirled it between her fingers until the petals came loose, drifting into the dark. Thank you, she said finally. Elias stood, the boards groaning under him. Don't thank me yet. He looked toward the ridge where the deputy had vanished. We'll need to be ready, she rose beside him. The horizon had swallowed the sun, leaving only a narrow band of fire behind the hills. The world felt fragile in that light, beautiful, fleeting, and about to change. Inside, the fire snapped and settled. Outside, the wind carried more wildflower petals across the porch. White against the gathering dusk, neither spoke again, but both understood what it meant. The law was coming, and so was the past. The days stretched long, gentle as slow river water. The danger still hovered somewhere beyond the hills. But inside the small circle of the homestead, time began to heal in quiet ways. Elias started with the roof, replacing split shingles, hammering nails into the sun-warmed boards. Clara steadied the ladder, passing tools without needing to be asked. Each sound, the thunk of the hammer, the creak of wood, the sigh of wind, became part of their language. By noon, sweat darkened the back of his shirt. She brought him water in a tin cup. He took it, nodding thanks. A small thing, but his smile, quick, uncertain, made her chest ache in a way she couldn't name. They rebuilt piece by piece, patched walls, straightened beams, mended fences. And between the work came laughter, rare at first, caught like sunlight in dust motes, then real, low and easy, spilling through the open door. The wildflowers returned with the rain. Pale blooms pushing through cracked soil as if to remind them that even the dead ground could grow something soft. Clara planted a few near the steps, pressing them into earth with careful fingers. Elias watched from the porch, not saying a word. She turned once and caught him looking. He didn't look away. On a slow afternoon, Elias took her behind the barn and handed her his rifle. If you're going to stay here, he said, you'll need to know how to use one. She hesitated, the weight of the gun unfamiliar. I've never shot anything. Good. Means you won't waste bullets. He guided her stance, hands steadying her shoulders, voice quiet against her ear. She felt the warmth of him, smelled the smoke and sweat that clung to his shirt. Breathe out when you pull the trigger, he said. Let it go like you mean it. She did. The shot cracked across the field, echoing through the hills. The tin can at the fence post shuddered, spun, and fell. Clara blinked in surprise. I hit it. Of course you did. She laughed then, full and unguarded. He found himself laughing, too. It was the first time he'd seen her smile without the weight of sorrow behind it. That night, they ate by lantern light. The cabin felt warmer now, the walls alive with the scent of pine sap and bread. Outside, crickets sang under the stars. Clara looked across the table. The flame painted his face in gold and shadow. The scar on his jaw caught the light, long, twisted, a mark of something that had burned too deep to ever fade. She asked, Why do you hide it?" He touched it unconsciously, fingers tracing the rough edge. "Because it's what's left of the worst day I ever lived." She waited. He leaned back, eyes somewhere far away. "My brother and I ran a drive one summer. Dry lightning hit the barn. He went back for the horses. I went after him. The roof came down before I could pull him out. Fire took him and near took me." His voice dropped. "Folks called it God's will. I called it punishment." Clara's throat tightened. "You went back for him. Didn't save him. You lived to save others," she said softly. "That's the kind of beauty no one sees." He looked at her then, really looked, as if he hadn't heard that word used for anything in years. Their hands brushed when they reached for the same cup. Neither pulled away. For a heartbeat, the world stilled, the night, the fire. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind stirred the wildflowers by the window. For the first time, safety felt like something possible, something earned. But then, faint as a memory, came the sound of hoofbeats, distant, slow, too deliberate to be the wind. Elias's eyes shifted toward the door. Clara felt her heart tighten again. The peace they'd built hung fragile, like glass waiting to break. The world wasn't done with them yet. The morning broke too still. No birdsong, no wind, just the dry whisper of silence before something cruel. Elias felt it first. He was splitting wood by the barn when the dog began to growl low, the kind of sound that comes from knowing what's coming before it arrives. Clara stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His gaze fixed on the ridge beyond the creek, where dust rose in a long, deliberate line. Riders. Too many for neighbors. Too steady for drifters. By the time the shapes grew clear, the sun had climbed enough to glint off metal. Rifles. Badges. The sheriff rode front, fat in the saddle, hat pulled low to shade the smirk already waiting on his mouth. Behind him, 5 men rode close, liquor bottles tied to their saddles, laughter already spilling like smoke before the fire. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, jaw tightening. "Inside," he said. Clara obeyed without argument. She closed the door, heart pounding, hands shaking as she grabbed the locket from the drawer and the wildflower from the sill. For a second she hesitated, then pried up the loose board beneath the rug and hid them both there. The symbol of what they'd built, hidden from men who couldn't understand it. The sound of hooves reached the yard. Wood creaked under heavy boots. "Morning, Gage," the sheriff called, voice thick with self-satisfaction. "Got some unfinished business here." Elias stepped off the porch, empty hands raised to show peace. "Don't see any business worth finishing." The sheriff swung down from his horse, boots sinking deep into the dirt. "You're harboring a fugitive. Widow Wynne owes debts and justice. She's property of the court." "She's under my roof," Elias said, calm but hard. "And she ain't property." The men around the sheriff chuckled, the sound mean and eager. One took a pull from his flask. "Ain't that sweet?" The hermit's got himself a cause. The sheriff's smile thinned. "You can step aside or you can hang beside her." "Don't much matter to me," Elias shook his head. "Not today." The sheriff's hand twitched toward his holster. "That a threat, Gage?" "No, a promise." Before the air could settle, 2 deputies moved forward, seizing him by the arms. Elias didn't fight at first. He let them grab, shove, spit their words. But when the sheriff struck him once, open-handed and cruel, the calm broke. Elias lunged, driving one man back into the fence post. The fight was fast, ugly, wood cracking, fists thudding, the sheriff shouting for order. But 6 against 1 was never a fair count. They slammed him into the dirt, boots and fists raining down. His lip split, blood painting his chin. A rifle butt cracked against his shoulder. The dog barked until a gunshot silenced it. Inside, Clara pressed a hand to her mouth. The sound of his pain hit her harder than fear ever had. She looked toward the corner where his rifle rested. Her pulse roared in her ears. When the sheriff kicked him to the ground and turned toward the cabin, she moved. The door swung open before he could reach it. Clara stepped out, the rifle steady in her hands. "Enough," she said. The men froze for half a breath, stunned by the sight. Her hair was loose, dress torn at the sleeve, face streaked with dirt, but her eyes held fire. "Put that down," the sheriff ordered, smirking again. Wouldn't want to hurt yourself, sweetheart. Her finger found the trigger. I said, she warned. Enough. He took a step closer. You think you scare me? She raised the barrel and fired into the air. The crack shattered the stillness, echoing through the canyon until even the horses flinched. Smoke curled from the muzzle. Her arms shaking but firm, Elias lifted his head from the dirt, vision swimming, and saw her standing there. The woman who had once stood silent at her own auction, now facing down a ring of armed men. She's not the only one who fights back, she said. Voice raw but steady. For a moment no one moved. The wind came rushing back, carrying the smell of gunpowder and blood. The sheriff's smirk faltered. He looked at her, then at Elias, then back again. Something in the moment shifted, the crowd of men no longer so sure, no longer so brave. He spat once into the dirt. This ain't over. Then he turned his horse, and one by one they followed, muttering, glancing back with eyes that no longer saw an easy victory. When the last hoofbeat faded, Clara dropped the rifle. It hit the porch with a dull thud. Elias pushed himself to his knees, blood mixing with dust. She ran to him, hands trembling, trying to lift him though he outweighed her by near 100 pounds. He smiled through the pain, a slow, broken thing. Didn't think you'd learn to shoot that fast. I didn't, she whispered. But I figured it out. He laughed once, winced, and looked toward the horizon where the riders had vanished. Then maybe, he said, they finally figured out we ain't running anymore. The prairie wind rose again, sweeping over the yard, scattering dust and wildflower petals from where they dried by the fence. The fight was over, for now. But the war was coming. The world came back to Elias in pieces, sound first, then pain. The scrape of boots, the groan of rope against wood, a crow calling somewhere beyond the ridge. He blinked against the pale light. Dawn was climbing slow, gray and merciless. His arms were tied behind a splintered post, wrists raw from the rope. His head throbbed where the rifle stock had met his skull. The sheriff's men moved through the clearing, half drunk, half awake. One stoked a small fire. Another checked the knot at the hanging tree. Elias could smell the iron tang of blood, his own, dried into his shirt. Rise and shine, hero, the sheriff called, voice smooth as spoiled cream. He stood near the tree line, adjusting his coat. Ghost Creek's about to see justice done proper. Elias swallowed against the dryness in his throat. This your kind of justice? For harboring a fugitive? For taking what ain't yours? The sheriff smiled, yellow-toothed. I call it balance. He turned to his men. String him up soon as the sun clears the ridge. We'll let the birds have him first. Laughter rippled through the camp. The sheriff poured himself a drink, the bottle glinting red in the light. Elias tugged at the ropes again, the fibers cutting deep. He thought of Clara, of her voice when she'd told him the truth, of her eyes when she'd raised the rifle. If she'd made it clear she was smart enough to run, he prayed she had. But prayer had never done him much good. The men went about their business, lazy and sure. The sheriff hummed, content, and then came the sound, faint at first, a rhythm beneath the wind. Hooves. One of the deputies frowned. You hear that? Another laughed. Probably her, running scared. The sheriff didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed. That ain't a gallop for running. That's a charge. The sound grew louder, rolling over the grass like thunder. The men turned toward the ridge. A figure broke through the morning mist, riding hard. Light, catching the steel of a rifle slung across her back. Clara. Her hair streamed behind her, her face pale with fury and fire. She didn't shout, didn't hesitate. The horse barreled straight through the camp, scattering men like quail. Get her! The sheriff roared, gunfire cracked. Bullets tore through smoke and dawnlight. She ducked low, the wind screaming past her ears. When she reached the post, she swung from the saddle, knife in hand. Elias caught her eyes, wild, alive, terrified. You shouldn't be here, he rasped. Too late, the knife sawed through the rope. Gunshots tore bark from the tree behind them. One man charged. Elias grabbed his shoulder and drove him into the dirt, disarming him with a sharp twist. They moved together without thinking, his hand finding her arm, hers reloading the rifle faster than fear could catch up. Ride, he shouted. They ran for the horses. Bullets hissed past. One struck the ground beside her foot, kicking up dust. Elias swung into the saddle, pulling her up behind him. She clung to his waist as the horse surged toward the creek, hooves hammering through the mist. The wind cut cold across their faces. Behind them, the sheriff's men gave chase, shouts breaking the morning quiet. "Hold on," Elias said. They burst through the line of willows, water flashing silver in the rising sun. Ghost Creek shimmered ahead, thin, winding, same place where it had all begun. He turned the horse hard, taking cover behind a fallen log. Clara slid off, breath ragged, clutching the rifle. "How many?" she asked. "Too many. Then we make them count." The sheriff's men fanned out across the creek bed. The echo of gunfire rolled through the valley. Elias fired once, twice, clean, deliberate shots. 2 men fell. Clara picked one off the ridge, the recoil bruising her shoulder, but she didn't flinch. The sheriff advanced last, slow and steady, a revolver gleaming in his hand. He was grinning again. "End of the line, Gage. Ain't no ghost or girl gonna save you now." Elias stood. The rifle was empty. Mud streaked his face, blood his shirt. But his eyes were clear, steady as the land itself. "Funny thing about ghosts," he said. "They remember." The sheriff fired first. The shot grazed Elias's arm. He stumbled, dropped behind the log. Clara's scream cut through the smoke. "Elias!" "I'm fine," he gasped. He reached for the pistol at his belt. Last bullet chambered, one chance. The sheriff stepped closer, boots sinking into the wet earth. "You see beauty in her now?" he taunted, voice low, mocking. "You see what she's cost you?" Elias rose slowly, eyes locked on him. Always did. He fired one shot. One echo. The sheriff's body twisted, fell backward into the creek. The water darkened where he lay. His badge slipped free, sinking into the mud beside the wildflowers that grew along the bank. Those same defiant blossoms that never stopped blooming, no matter what tried to trample them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The smoke lifted, the air filled with the hum of waking insects, the rush of water over stone. Clara knelt beside Elias, her hands on his arm, checking the wound. It was shallow. She laughed through her tears, half in shock, half in relief. He looked past her to the horizon already burning gold. "It's over," he said. She shook her head. "No, it's just beginning." He smiled, slow, weary, real. "Then let's see where it takes us," the creek whispered below them. The sheriff's men had fled, their courage gone with their leader. As the sun broke fully over the ridge, light spilled across the water, catching on the petals floating in the current. Ghost Creek was quiet again. But this time it wasn't haunted. It was holy. The cabin stood whole, its roof patched, its porch rebuilt, its walls washed clean of the smoke that once haunted them. The prairie stretched wide and green, soft under the forgiving light of early summer. Wildflowers grew in wild defiance. Everywhere the ground had known blood, the earth answered with color. Clara knelt among them that morning, dirt beneath her nails, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The air was warm, full of bees and the scent of sage. She pressed a small sprout into the soil, whispering to it like a secret. "Grow strong," she murmured. "You're safe now." The door creaked open behind her. Elias stepped out slow, limping, coffee steaming in one hand. The sunlight caught his scar, softening it until it looked more like a memory than a wound. He'd refused the doctor's offer to cut it clean, said some marks weren't meant to disappear. He watched her for a while before speaking. "You've near turned this place into a garden," Clara smiled over her shoulder. "That was always the plan. You plant enough flowers, you'll bring the bees, then we'll have honey." He chuckled under his breath, easing himself down onto the porch step. The sound of his laugh, still rare, made the world feel less empty. She joined him, brushing the dirt from her skirt. For a while they watched the wind ripple through the field. The wildflowers moved like waves, endless and unafraid. Elias took a sip of his coffee, then looked at her, a sly tilt in his voice. "Still think you owe me?" Clara raised a brow. "You mean for saving my life?" "For saving mine," he said. Her smile softened. "You're wrong about that. I didn't save you, no." She shook her head. "You saved yourself. I just reminded you it was worth doing." He let that sit between them, quiet as prayer. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain from far away. "You paid in courage," he said at last. She laughed softly. "And here I thought I had nothing left to give." He turned toward her, eyes glinting in the light. "You gave more than most ever could." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, the kind that held everything they didn't need to say out loud. Clara leaned her head against the porch post, watching a petal drift loose and dance away on the wind. "No one's ever called me beautiful," she whispered. Elias looked at her then. Truly looked, past the scars on her wrists, past the worn fabric of her dress, past every cruel word that had ever been thrown at her. "Then they've been blind all along," he said. She blinked, fighting the heat rising in her chest. He didn't look away, didn't try to soften the weight of the words. They just settled between them, gentle and sure. The dog barked once from the yard, chasing a rabbit through the grass. The sound made them both laugh. For a heartbeat, life felt ordinary again. No lawman, no fear, just the hum of bees and the taste of peace. Elias reached for her hand. It was rough from work, calloused like his own. Their fingers fit together without trying. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. "Used to," he said. "Now I think about staying," she smiled. "Then we'll stay." The wind rose, scattering wildflower petals across the porch. Some landed in his coffee. Others brushed against their boots, carried toward the field where the soil had once run red. The petals lifted, spinning into the air, catching the morning light, bright, fragile, alive. Elias watched them drift and said, half to himself, "Ghost Creek finally looks alive again." Clara followed his gaze, eyes shining. Maybe it always was. It just needed time. The sun climbed higher, gold spilling across the cabin's roof. Two silhouettes sat side by side on the porch, framed by a field of color that had grown from pain. The wind carried the petals away, whispering through the grass as if telling the story one last time. The field, the scar, the love, everything that had been broken was, at last, whole.